There is a number on the screen. It is moving so fast that your eyes cannot track the last four digits. That number is $38 trillion. It represents the gross national debt of the United States, but numbers that big are abstract. They feel like monopoly money. They feel like a score in a video game that doesn't really matter. We're told by economists, by politicians, and by the media that deficits don't matter, that we owe it to ourselves, that the party can go on forever. They are lying to you. Math is the only language that doesn't lie. And right now, the masses are screaming that the American experiment is entering its terminal phase. We aren't just borrowing money anymore. We are cannibalizing our future to pay for the sins of the present. The Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan scorekeepers of this disaster, have projected that we are now locked into a cycle of $2 trillion annual deficits for the next decade. Not during a war, not during a depression, but as the baseline. If you want to know how superpower dies, you don't look at its army, you look at its ledger. In the last 15 years, the United States has normalized financial insanity. We have broken every historical record for reckless spending, and we have done it under both parties, under every ideology, in times of sickness and in times of health. Today, we're going to look at the 7 largest budget deficits in American history, 7 nails in the coffin of the US dollar. And here is the terrifying part. These are random years scattered throughout history. All 7 of them have happened in the last 16 years. 5 of them have happened since 2020. We're going to count them down from the 7th largest to the absolute catastrophe of number 1. And as we go through this list, you will see the pattern emerge. You will see how we went from a country that produced wealth to a country that simply prints it. This is the autopsy of the American economy. Let's start with number 7. Fiscal year 2022. The deficit was $1.375 trillion. Now, context is everything. 2022 was supposed to be the victory lap. The worst of the COVID pandemic was theoretically over. The economy was reopening. In a sane world, this is when the government stops spending and starts paying down the credit card. Instead, we kept swiping. The federal government, under President Biden and a Democratic Congress, used a legislative trick called budget reconciliation. This allows them to bypass the filibuster and pass fiscal legislation with a simple majority. They use this to run through the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA. On the surface, it sounded great. Clean energy credits, prescription drug reform, expanded healthcare subsidies. They told us it would reduce the deficit by $238 billion over a decade through corporate taxes and IRS enforcement. But at the same time, they passed the bipartisan infrastructure law, roads, bridges, broadband. The CBO estimated this would add $256 billion to the deficit. Do the math. The savings from one bill were immediately wiped out by the spending of the other. Result? A $1.375 trillion hole in the budget. Why does this matter? Because 2022 proved that we can no longer function without a stimulus. Even when the emergency is over, the spending must continue. The government had become the economy. We were told this was a return to normalcy. If a $1.3 trillion loss is normal, we are already dead. But 2022 is the smallest deficit on our list today. It only gets worse from here. To find number 6, we have to travel back in time, to the year that changed everything, fiscal year 2009. The deficit was $1.412 trillion. For those of you too young to remember, you have to understand, before 2009, $1 trillion deficit was science fiction. It was a number used in doomsday novels. The previous record had been around $450 billion. Then came the great financial crisis. The banking system collapsed, the housing market vaporized, and the government decided to break the glass. This deficit was a bipartisan creation. It started under George Washington Bush with TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. We bailed out the banks, we bailed out the automakers, We poured cash into Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to stop the housing market from hitting zero. Then, President Obama entered office and signed the American Recovery and Reinvestment ACT, an $831 billion stimulus package. At the time, we were told this was a once-in-a-lifetime event, a singular emergency measure to save the world from a second Great Depression. We were told that once the crisis passed, we would go back to fiscal responsibility. They lied. 2009 wasn't a one-off. It was the precedent. It taught politicians a dangerous lesson. You can print $1 trillion and the sky doesn't fall immediately. You can bail out failure and get reelected. 2009 broke the psychological barrier. Once you print $1 trillion, you can never go back to counting in billions. This was the moment the US government decided that consequences were optional. Fast forward back to the present era. Rank number 5, fiscal year 2023. The deficit climbs to $1.695 trillion. This year is terrifying for a different reason. In 2009 and 2020, we had deficits because we were fighting crisis. But in 2023, the crisis was the debt itself. Inflation had peaked at 9.1% the year before, a direct result of all that money printing. To fight it, the Federal Reserve hiked interest rates to a 40-year high. Here is the trap. When the government owes more than $30 trillion and interest rates go up, the cost to service that debt explodes. In FY 2023, the cost of paying interest on the national debt rose by $177 billion, a 33% increase in a single year. We weren't borrowing to build roads. We weren't borrowing to fight a war. We were borrowing money to pay the interest on the money we already borrowed. This is what economists call a debt spiral. The relief programs from COVID were winding down. We should have seen the deficit drop. Instead, it grew. Why? Because the bond market demanded a pound of flesh. This is the point of no return. When your interest payments start consuming your budget, you have two choices: default on the debt or print more money to pay the interest, which causes more inflation, which raises interest rates, which increases the debt payments. In 2023, we chose this spiral. This brings us to the year we just finished, fiscal year 2025. The first largest deficit in history at $1.78 trillion. If you thought a change in administration would fix the math, 2025 proved you wrong. Republicans in Congress and the Trump administration passed the One Big Beautiful Bill ACT. The goal? Extend the 2017 tax cuts that were set to expire and provide no relief. Now, they try to offset this. They repealed the Biden-era clean energy subsidies. No more AB tax credits, no more green slush funds. They reduced federal outlays. But it wasn't enough. The CBO estimated that the tax cuts in this bill would increase deficits by $4 trillion over the next decade. The lesson of 2025 is brutal. Both parties are addicted to debt. The Democrats want to spend money on social programs and green energy. The Republicans want to cut taxes without cutting the major entitlement programs. The result is identical. The deficit stays near $1.8 trillion. The names on the bills change, their rhetoric changes. The Democrats call it investment, the Republicans call it relief. But look at the bottom line. It's red ink as far as the eyes can see. By 2025, the deficit had become structural. It didn't matter who sat in the Oval Office. The machine was on autopilot, driving us off a cliff at $1.78 trillion a year. Now we enter the top 3. The bronze medal of bankruptcy goes to fiscal year 2024, $1.834 trillion. Why was this year worse than 2025 or 2023? It wasn't a new war, it wasn't a new stimulus package, it was demographics. In 2024, the bill for America's aging population finally came due. Social Security spending jumped by $107 billion. Medicare expenditures rose by $25 billion. Combined with the high interest rates we mentioned earlier, which added another $240 billion in servicing costs, the budget simply broke. This is the gray zone event everyone knew was coming. For decades, we knew the baby boomers would retire. We knew the ratio of workers to retirees would collapse. We did nothing to prepare. We spent a surplus. We raided the lockbox. In 2024, the reality hit. We're borrowing nearly $2 trillion a year just to keep the lights on for elderly and pay the bankers who lend us the cash. There is no cutting waste that fixes this. You can cut every penny of foreign aid, every penny of the woke agenda, every penny of congressional salaries, and you wouldn't even make a dent in a $1.8 trillion deficit driven by entitlements and interest. 2024 proved that the mandatory spending alone is enough to sink the ship. Now, we jump to the heavyweights, the numbers that defy logic. Number 2 is fiscal year 2021. The deficit was $2.775 trillion. This was the year of the overshoot. The initial shock of COVID had passed. The economy was technically recovering, but the government decided to floor the gas pedal anyway. The Biden administration and Democrats passed the American Rescue Plan. $1.9 trillion passed on a strict party line votes. The CBO warned us. They projected it would add $1.8 trillion to the debt. In FY 2021 alone, we incurred over $1.1 trillion of the cost. This was the moment inflation was guaranteed. You cannot inject nearly $3 trillion of new money into an economy that is supply constrained without devaluing the currency. They told us inflation would be transitory. They were wrong. They told us the spending would pay for itself in growth. They were wrong. What 2021 gave us was a sugar high that rotted the teeth of the American economy. It set the stage for the interest rate hikes that are destroying us now. It was a willful, deliberate decision to trade the value of the dollar for short-term political popularity. And finally, the champion of collapse. The single greatest year of financial destruction in the history of the human race. Fiscal year 2020. $3.132 trillion. This was the event horizon. When COVID hit, the government panicked. In a rare display of bipartisanship, Republicans and Democrats joined hands to pass the CARES ACT. $2.2 trillion in a single bill. Stimulus checks enhanced unemployment that paid people more not to work. The Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP, that handed out forgivable loans like candy. Billions to state and local governments. The deficit that year wasn't just large. It was larger than the entire GDP of the United Kingdom. It was more debt in 1 year than the United States accumulated in its first 200 years of existence combined. We were told it was necessary to save the economy, but at what cost? 2020 changed the DNA of America. It established the principle that if anything goes wrong, a virus, a recession, a war, the government will simply print the difference. It severed the final link between production and consumption. In 2020, we learned that money doesn't come from work. It comes from the Federal Reserve. And once a population learns that, the empire is over. So there you have it, the 7 largest deficits in history. 2020, $3.13 trillion. 2021, 2.77. 2024, 1.83. 2025, 1.78. 2023, 1.69. 2009, 1.41. And 2022, $1.37 trillion. Notice the pattern? With the exception of 2009, every single one of them happened in the last 5 years. This isn't a cycle. It's an acceleration. The CBO now projects deficits of $2 trillion annually for the next decade. That creates another $20 trillion in debt by 2035. But that assumes no new wars, no new pandemics, no new recessions. Do you really think the next 10 years will be crisis-free? I don't think so. The United States is now borrowing money to pay interest on money it borrowed to solve problems it created. It is a mathematical impossibility. There are only two ways this ends. One, we default, destroying the global financial system and the credit of the United States overnight. Or two, we inflate, printing money until the dollar in your pocket is worth less than the paper it's printed on. Looking at this list, looking at the bipartisan addiction to spending, looking at the sheer scale of the numbers, which path do you think they are going to choose? They would choose inflation. They would choose to destroy your savings to save their system. The deficits of the last 5 years weren't an anomaly. They were the new normal. The era of fiscal responsibility is dead. The era of the great debasement has begun. The question isn't if the collapse is coming. The math says it's already here. The only question is, what are you doing to prepare for it? If you want to know what happens in stage 8, subscribe, because the history books tell us exactly what comes next, and it isn't pretty.